Well, good morning. My name is Arthur Brandwood, and welcome to this June 2018 version of the Brandwood Biomedical Live webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about market access in Australia and leveraging international approvals for TGA registrations. Now, as many of you will know, TGA already widely uses CE mark as a means of recognition of an overseas regulatory review for the purposes of medical device registration in Australia. But lately, the agency has been looking further afield and looking at other options for recognizing additional regulators for the purpose of bridging or even avoiding altogether doing a direct regulatory review in Australia. So today we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how TGA might leverage things like a US 510K or a Canadian medical device license or something else as a means of a replacement for its own direct review of a medical device prior to placement on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. Now, this is a live webinar. We will take questions at the end. If you look at your control panel, you'll see you've got a Q&A section. I just point out that if you enter a question into there at any time in the webinar, I will be able to see that at the end, and we'll take the questions and have a discussion at that point. So here's our agenda. Firstly, I'm just going to do a wee bit of a refresher, do a bit of look at what is current TGA practice based on CE marking or direct TGA reviews. Ask what's going on at the moment in Europe and elsewhere. There's a lot of things happening in the regulatory world, and that is influencing the way TGA is doing all of this. We'll ask the question, what is a comparable regulator? TGA has said very clearly that if they're going to do this sort of thing, if they're going to recognize other regulators, they've got to be comparable to the sort of things they will do. So we'll look at how that's judged. And then we'll come to how might TGA use international evidence and the sort of approaches that are likely to be adopted by the agency. Now, the agency has been undergoing a consultation over the past year, has not yet announced the outcomes of that. We're expecting an announcement reasonably soon, probably within months, possibly sooner than that. What we're going to look at now is just how might that look in anticipation of TGA's announcement of a broader approach to recognition of overseas regulatory evidence. So just a quick refresher. The Australian regulatory model is essentially based on the European. The European model, of course, was extended by the Global Harmonisation Task Force, who prepared a range of additional guidances. And what Australia has effectively done is picked up the GHTF versions of guidances where they exist. So, for example, the European essential requirements exist in GHTF as essential principles, slightly different wording, same basic idea, and the essential principles is the text that's used in Australian regulation. So we have a regulatory system based on those primary requirements in the essential principles, the use of harmonized standards as a means of demonstration of compliance with the essential principles, a rules-based classification, which can be applied to any technology at any time, and regulatory intervention based on the risk class. So the higher the risk class, according to classification rules, the more scrutiny you see in the pre-market review. And then all of that complemented by a post-market monitoring system, which is called vigilance in Europe, and the same phrase finds its way into the Australian vernacular. So that's the Australian regulatory model, really a very close copy of European. And there are, at the moment, really two paths to market in Australia. You can either go directly to TGA for a conformity assessment under that model, and then once you have received the conformity assessment certificate, you can then register any device within the scope of your assessment and go to the market. Or, because the European system is so very similar to Australia's, TGA currently recognizes a CE certificate as being essentially equivalent to a conformity assessment certificate that's issued by TGA. And so you can as well bring a CE mark to Australia, bring a CE certificate, and use that as the basis for a registration. The Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, the ARTG, is the principal legal point of control in Australia. It's an offence to supply a medical device in Australia that's not entered into the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, with the exception of special circumstances such as clinical trials and special access and a number of other exemptions. Let's first of all very briefly look at what TGA does with conformity assessment, just in one slide. And I just want to make the point that there is a direct one-to-one correlation in the Australian regulations on the right column of this table with the annexes of the European Medical Device and Active Implantable Medical Device Directives on the left. The way the Australian regulations are written is a set of different words, but essentially the same content. So all the annexes are there as different parts in the Therapeutic Goods Medical Devices Regulations of 2002. You can therefore go to TGA and have a conformity assessment according to the equivalent regulation to the European Annex. You can have all of the routes of conformity done by TGA. And that will result in a TGA certificate, and then you can go forward and register your devices. But the other alternative is to use the CE mark. And the simple truth is that most of devices are registered in Australia using the CE mark. Of all the devices that require a TGA review, so everything apart from a simple class 1, something more than 95% of those devices are actually registered in Australia based on the CE mark. And how does that work in practice? This is really the process. So we have three parties involved: the original manufacturer of the device, the Australian sponsor has to be a legal entity within Australia to deal with the TGA, the equivalent of a European authorised representative or a market access holder in other markets. And there must be a legal sponsor in Australia because that's who TGA controls. And then there's TGA itself, based in Canberra in the national capital. The manufacturer goes and gets their CE certification. They hold the technical file, and in addition, they determine the class in Australia against the Australian classification rules, which are very closely similar to the European. There are a small number of differences, but almost every device will be the same, and prepares a legal document, the Australian Declaration of Conformity, stating that the manufacturer holds the evidence to demonstrate compliance against the Australian essential principles. The CE certificate is passed to the sponsor, who then submits it online through the e-business system to TGA, who verify the authenticity of that certificate. And once that is done, then that is considered to be accepted manufacturer evidence, and it's entered onto TGA's manufacturer database. At that point, the sponsor can then come back and make applications for registration of any device within the scope of that certificate manufactured by the holder of that certificate. That is also filed by the e-business system, and TGA will make an assessment of that application. And in most places, it's simply a verification that the device is within the scope of the certificate, and that will then result in an ARTG entry, and the sponsor can then supply the device to the market. All very straightforward. The assessment stage, in some cases though, in certain higher risk devices, and for any device, if TGA so choose, can be augmented through an application audit. And that is where TGA specifically requests more information. They will go to the sponsor and ask that the sponsor arrange for the manufacturer to supply certain technical file data and maybe the declaration of conformity for TGA to do a desktop review. This is not a complete conformity assessment. It's simply a desktop review of some of the higher level documentation. Application audits are mandatory for certain types of devices, including all class 3s and all active implants, and a number of specified class 2B devices and IVDs. This list really reflects the old registrable devices under the pre-2000 regulations, plus certain IVDs where there are future intentions for reimbursement and scheduling, or national screening where those are required to be subject to application audit before entry on the register. There are certain exclusions to this sort of CE mark fast track. Some devices, particularly class 3 devices with an integral medicine and class 3 devices with a biological component are required to undergo direct TGA conformity assessment. For these, you cannot use a CE certificate to gain an ARTG entry. Although the fact of a CE conformity assessment already in place may allow TGA to abridge their assessment. For example, if you hold an ISO 13485 certificate, the agency often elects not to do a 13485 audit prior to the approval and may do an audit at a later stage. So to summarize the current TGA process, the process is risk-based and the amount of regulatory review increases according to the risk class, and these are the basic groupings of devices which see different processes. For class 1 devices, it's simply an electronic filing and notification, and you go straight to market. Very similar to what happens in Europe. You can file and have the device entered onto the ARTG within 24 hours. It's an overnight update of the database. Following day, you will have your registration. For class 2As, 2Bs, and class 1 sterile or measuring function devices with a CE mark, where the conformity assessment is supported by a CE certificate, similarly, you can file and go straight to the register once the TGA have verified that the device is within the scope of your certificate, and that can be a very quick process. Our record for that is, in fact, a 24-hour approval, where we've had something approved the next day. Usually, it's a week or two. Sometimes it can be a few weeks. TGA can elect to do an application audit on these applications. They tend to do that where the device is unusual, where there may be a question about the correctness of the certification, or whether it's a type of device where TGA has a current interest in safety issues. Maybe there are some things going on in the market which directs TGA attention to a particular device type, and TGA will call in the application audit and review some of that high-level evidence. They'll tend to look at things like risk assessments, clinical evidence reports, and the labeling and instructions for use. For those specified 2B devices and for class 3 and AIMD, the application audit is mandatory, and TGA charges a fee for that. And that then extends the process to sometimes several months and to proceed with that audit. For class 3 and AIMD devices, they of course enter the register with a unique product identified as an extra field, and each model and each unique product has its own entry on the register. And then for those high-risk devices where conformity assessment goes through a direct TGA review, they then go straight onto the register once the TGA conformity assessment has been approved. You can file and have things put on the register immediately without any further review. So that's the process at the moment. There is the option for manufacturers of any device, of course, to elect to go direct to TGA and have TGA do the conformity assessment. It's not restricted to the high-risk devices. Now, a little bit of history. Let's just look at what's going on elsewhere. Just a very short while ago, about 7 years ago, remember where American regulatory processes were seen as rather slow, and a lot of US companies were going to Europe first. So this is a study back in 2011 from Northwestern University, where they concluded that the predictability of the FDA process was a real concern back then. Things were not going to time, and they were somewhat capricious. And of US companies, it was reckoned that only 4% of US companies back in 2011 were going to FDA first. About 80% initially went to EU bodies, and by the time it made the decision and completed the process, about 65% of US manufactured devices were being CE marked before they were getting their domestic FDA clearance. But how things have changed. Shortly after that, we had these episodes of the PIP breast implant and the ASR hip from Johnson & Johnson. Very well-known case studies. The first one where there was a regulatory fraud, deliberate breach of quality systems regulations and substitution of materials and inadequate quality controls. That led to an increase in governance in the European regulatory approach, a step up of how the notified bodies are now expected to supervise manufacturers. And the ASR-HIP, along with a number of other well-publicized failures of implantable devices, has led to a considerable increase in the new regulations in Europe on the reliance of direct clinical data for high-risk and implantable devices. So what we're seeing in Europe now is a transition to the medical device regulations from the old medical device directives. The key differences there are those two things. What is not changing is the basic regulatory model. The model that's used here in Australia will continue to be used in Europe. They will still have essential requirements, risk classifications, third-party assessment, risk-based reviews, and use of standards. None of that is changing. What is changing is in the detail, extension of safety and performance requirements, a bit of update to the classification, so more devices now fall into class 3. Clinical evaluation considerably strengthened, as we just mentioned, greater scrutiny processes and stricter review, strengthening post-market, and this gigantic UDAMED database, which will drive continuous reporting and continuous vigilance. Although the UDAMED database looks very like it's not going to be ready on time, and there will have to be some extensions about the parts of the process that require the use of the database. And here we have Neil McAleenan, senior member of the Irish Competent Authority, speaking in China last year, talking about what the current European experience is of getting this new regulatory system up and running. And the answer is it's taking time. He's talking here just about the process for redesignating the notified bodies, which is estimated as an end-to-end process to take at least 18 months. We should be coming towards the end of that process now, and we should be seeing the first designations, but not yet. We are now approximately halfway through the transition period from medical device directives to medical device regulations, or we will be coming up to halfway before the end of this year. And if you care to go and do some Google searches and poke around the internet, you'll see a massive commentary on how this is all going and how time is running out. And just a few things. I did this myself just yesterday, and just some interesting quotes of what's really happening right now in Europe. Gert Boss of QServe observed that the waiting lists of some notified bodies are now running up to 12 to 14 months, whilst others are becoming more selective in the types of clients and the scope of products. Certainly we're seeing that here in Australia. We've seen some notified bodies withdrawing from serving clients in this part of the world. There's a pullback to the centre, and we're seeing certainly blowing out waiting lists. If you haven't approached a notified body now, you're going to find it difficult to get your foot in the door and get things done in a sensible length of time. Merlin Ritchell, writing in MedTech Europe, pointed out that if we assume for IVDs, assume that all the 22 notified bodies who are currently designated to assess against the in vitro diagnostics directive, let's assume they all achieve designation under the IVD regulation, and that's by no means guaranteed, by the way. Each notified body would on average need to assess at least 1,600 IVDs. The new IVD regulations bring a whole lot of things into regulatory review for the first time. That's a huge increase in workload. 788% reckons Merlin, about a factor of 8 increase. So that's going to be a challenge. Although, to be fair, there is a longer transition period for the IVD directive. It's a 5-year rather than a 3-year transition. It's still going to be very difficult. And here's Sue Spencer at UL pointing out that UL sees their first duty as to serve their current clients, both for regulatory review and quality system, and they will take on additional clients as capacity permits. We've seen this already. The larger notified bodies are looking after their larger clients. They've already started pre-reviews with the very big clients. And if you are coming to them for the first time, take a ticket and stand in line. because they're going to deal with their existing clients first, and then they will take new business as and when. And so it's getting increasingly difficult to find a notified body who can actually help you and assess you against the medical device regulations. And in the United Kingdom, we have a very special case. Eric Vollerbrecht from Exxon Lawyers in the Netherlands points out that there's also the question of Brexit. Without agreement that the United Kingdom stays connected to the European Union in a manner like Switzerland does, where there's a mutual recognition agreement, Britain will no longer have notified bodies after March next year. Time is running out for the United Kingdom particularly, and of course there are several large notified bodies which are based in the United Kingdom, and those are going to struggle because they're going to have to relocate if they wish to continue operating as notified bodies. Meanwhile, things have been improving in the United States. Here's the head of the United States China office, again speaking at the CIMDR conference in China last year, pointing out that things are getting better. Review times here for post-market, for pre-market approvals, the highest level of FDA review, are coming down quite dramatically. The same is happening with 510Ks. The FDA has been putting in a lot of effort to get its processes in order, and is reaping the dividends in much faster approvals in the United States. So at the same time, we're seeing blowouts in timelines and greater lengths of review in the European Union. We're seeing reductions in the United States and much smoother reviews there. And then one final quote, and you'll have seen this in some of our earlier webinars. It's true that John Skerritt, the head of TGA, has said a number of times in public that in his view, it's crazy that TGA is in the business of assessment of medical devices. I should qualify that. What John is really talking about, Professor Skerritt saying, is that TGA is a small agency. It really needs to focus on those high-risk devices, particularly those with medicines and biologics, and not attempt to assess the whole range of medical devices that are marketed in Australia. There's something like 1 million different devices on the register, some tens of thousands of entries, covering about 1 million different product lines because they are grouped. There's no way that the 100 or so people in the devices program in TGA can assess all of those directly. And so TGA focuses on that very small slice, less than 5% of very high-risk devices, and at the moment relies on CE mark for all of the other assessments. TGA was reviewed a few years ago, one of many reviews into TGA, and this is the big one, the so-called SAMSOM review, the review of medicines and medical devices regulation. And a number of recommendations came out of that review, and one of those was to streamline pre-market through harmonization with other regulators, and a bunch of specific recommendations, of which the one we're concerned with today is that review said TGA needs to utilize approvals by a range of comparable authorities and not just CE. So TGA has been busily consulting on all of the outcomes of that review, and I want to talk now particularly about what they've been saying about use of comparable overseas regulators. Here's the specific consultation document that went out in May of last year, about a year ago now, on comparable overseas regulators for medical devices and the criteria and implementation of use of those overseas decisions to support Australian regulatory review. And the document really talks about two things. It says, there are two ways of going about this. Firstly, TGA can directly use those overseas approvals from other regulators and use those as a means of making their own decisions. Or there is the other option of actually work sharing, doing parallel reviews. Now, I think that's going to take a little longer. It's something that already happens in medicines. To do this in medical devices is going to take longer, where there would need to be arrangements put in place between TGA and an overseas agency to maybe share a particular review of a particular device where the applications are submitted in parallel to both agencies. That's certainly not happening yet, but the agency is thinking about it. But what are the issues in doing this? two things really. How comparable are the overseas regulators and how do we measure that? And then how do you bridge the gap between what's done in Australia and what's done overseas? Overseas processes are different. How do you bridge the gap so that you know that the Australian requirements are being met by review of an international process and international data set? TGA set a number of criteria in their consultation. They talked about how to assess the comparability of the regulatory framework between TGA and the overseas regulator. And they were really looking at these different things. They're saying, well, the overseas regulator needs to have similar objectives. The outcome needs to be the same. They're looking for safety and effectiveness, compliance with some essential requirements, and a similar framework, or maybe if the framework's different, there need to be ways of bridging that gap. One of the things they will be looking for is access to unredacted reports from overseas regulators as a means of supporting their review if they're going to rely on an overseas decision. And that there's an underlying operational alignment, particularly on things like use of standards, the same technical basis of the review, and of course, language. TGA operates in English. We do speak a sort of English language here in Australia, and clearly English-speaking regulators are the ones that TGA will be most interested in. Let's just look at that in a bit more detail. How might TGA compare the regulatory framework with an overseas regulator to their own? It's about those similar objectives and frameworks. It's about looking at how the overseas regulator uses things like standards. It's clearly TGA is going to look for English language speaking regulators, so that means FDA, Canada are likely to be the first ones off the block. TGA particularly pointed to IMDRF membership, the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. TGA is a founding member of that, and it's likely to certainly work with its IMDRF partners in the first instance, because there is a commitment to convergence and harmonization within that organization, and there are already open communication channels through the processes of IMDRF and where the regulators are talking to each other. They will want to see a complete life cycle approach. It's not just about pre-market, looking at what are the post-market processes overseas, as well as the pre-market review. Formal frameworks for information sharing to support communication and cooperation with the overseas regulators will need to be established. There are a lot of informal frameworks that exist already, of course. They'll need to set some formal ones. There are some formal ones in the medicine space. For example, TGA already has direct access to the United States FDA's GMP database for the purposes of assessing medicines GMP, and there's no reason why they couldn't explore similar arrangements for looking at devices GMP compliance. And they will look at what is the expertise of the overseas regulator, the capacity and experience of that regulator in doing full de novo reviews, and are there established processes for scientific assessment, for peer review, and where necessary referral to expert panels, because that's the thing. Those are the things that TGA does. So how may all that work in practice? We've looked at how it's done with CE mark already, but how's it going to work with something like an FDA approval where the processes are somewhat different? It may be instructive actually to look at what currently happens in Australia for IVDs. This is the TGA process chart for IVD reviews and approvals and registrations in Australia. It's somewhat similar to what goes on with medical devices, but the key difference is here in the use of manufacturer's evidence. So you'll see that here the documents that can be used for support of manufacturer's evidence are somewhat different, because in Europe, under the current IVD directives, there are very few devices that require CE marking. In Europe, under the current arrangements, most IVDs are self-declared, and therefore there's nothing you can bring from Europe to support manufacturer's evidence. There's no external review for most IVDs, whereas under the current system in Australia with a 4-tier classification, TGA requires a conformity assessment on most of the IVDs. Europe is moving to a system like this, and we'll see some changes down the track. We might see IVDs align more with the way medical devices are done, but right now there's very few CE certificates. So what does TGA accept in lieu? Firstly, they can take a TGA certificate, their own direct conformity assessment, of course. They can take a CE certificate where it exists. But the other ways they can do this is that they will recognize an ISO 13485 certificate issued by a registrar accredited under the International Accreditation Federation. They can accept a CANDICAS certificate with or without design control, and design control is required for Class 3 IVDs, but it's not required for Class 2. They can accept those, and as CANDICAS disappears from the field and NDISAP is its replacement for Canada and is used more widely in other jurisdictions, it's likely that TGA will accept NDISAP certificates as an alternative to CANDICAS, or as an alternative to ISO 13485. So with all of those different forms of evidence that there are controls over the manufacture of the IVD and then supplemented by application audits, then it's likely that that's the way it's done here. And so that really might point to how TGA may approach use of other regulatory evidence from around the world, other than CE mark. For medical devices, there's no reason why they can't take the same approach, where they might take overseas regulatory documents and then perhaps supplement them with application audits, although the application audits may be a little different to what's done with medical devices for Europe, because there might be different gaps to be filled, and it's the application audit that is going to fill the gap. So let's move on. And those just, by the way, are the current evidence supplied for medical devices. So I just need to clear those. So let's just look at what the evidence looks like. And here's a slide that's come from one of our previous webinars where we looked in detail at technical files and technical documentation to support regulatory review. And let's just start off by looking on the left column at what is required currently in Australia and in Europe for technical file evidence to support regulatory review. There's a bunch of overview and administrative information. But then we have in Australia and in Europe the regulatory documents of declarations of conformity, the certificates, and the essential requirements checklist. Then we have the design documentation, essentially extracted from the design history file of plans, records, risk management, input requirements, verification, testing, clinical validation reports, the clinical evidence, and the final device specification, including all the labelings and packaging and instructions for use. And then we have the manufacturing information, all of the production process requirements and specifications, which are typically assessed in the process of an ISO 13485 audit. And in United States speak, that's the device master record, which also would be reviewed at audit by the United States FDA for a US assessment. Let's just look at what goes on with a 510K. Similarly, a bunch of overarching administrative and regulatory documentation, including the 510K summary, which deals with predicate assessments, predicate comparisons. But then the risk management component is pulled out in summary form into a 510K. All of the device testing goes into the 510K to support the safety and performance assessments, including the full design descriptions and specifications, including all the testing reports that support safety, including clinical information or data in a smaller number. This is one of the differences. The bulk of US 510Ks have no clinical data in them, and that's going to be a gap that will need to be filled. Indications for use. And then substantial equivalence discussions. The US FDA, of course, the 510K clearance process is based around a comparison with an already approved predicate. That's not so different as might seem to be the case, because, of course, the European clinical evaluation reports now require that you compare your device with one or more similar devices already approved in Europe, or in the case of Australia, already approved in Australia. So there is a growing convergence in terms of the notion of use of predicate devices. So all of that means that we have regulatory data sets in the United States for 510Ks, which are actually closer than might initially seem to be the case to a European or an Australian technical file. So what does the TGA look at in an application audit? What they typically look at the moment is for a European approved device, if you're bringing a CE mark device to Australia and it's subject to an application audit, TGA will look at the labeling and the instructions for use. They'll look at the clinical evidence report, and they'll look at the risk assessment report. And they'll look at the CE certificate and declaration of conformity. Those are the things that are called up in an application audit. How might that look if the TGA is going to do an application audit for, say, a US or a Canadian approval? We might expect, instead of the CE certificate, that we're going to see TGA asking for an MDSAP certificate, an ISO 13485 certificate, or possibly looking for a United States QSR establishment inspection report. That's certainly done by other regulators in the region. Taiwan and Singapore, for example, will rely on a US FDA QSR report. And then looking at the specific regulatory documents, the Canadian license might be seen as somewhat comparable to a CE certificate for many devices, and maybe TGA getting hold of the assessment report for higher-risk devices. Similarly, for 510K or PMA reviewed devices, I would imagine TGA would have a high level of confidence in a PMA, which is a very searching review, and maybe want to see the summary report. And similarly, they may want to see the unredacted FDA review documentation on a 510K. But there's a question mark there yet, because the agency has not yet announced the specifics of this. They are already starting to look at MDSAP certificates to support use in Australia. But that's pretty much case by case. The key thing is, what are they going to look for in US and Canadian regulations? These are likely to be the first ones, simply because of the language. It's much more difficult for TGA to use, for example, a Japanese PMDA regulatory decision, because all of the review documentation is not in English. Similarly in China, similarly in Brazil. All of those are non-English speaking jurisdictions where TGA would find difficulty in dealing with the regulatory documentation. So let's just bring that together in summary. How might TGA leverage overseas approvals? It's true that they already heavily rely on what goes on in Europe. Most devices approved in Australia are done so based on CE certification. So that raises a question. What's the likely demand for use of other approvals? How many devices have FDA or Canadian approval but not CE? And the answer a couple of years ago would have been not many. But now maybe that's more than as expected. Certainly we are seeing increasing levels of inquiry from United States manufacturers who are finding the current CE process all too difficult, simply because of the delays involved and the increasing costs, and are electing not to go to Europe until the European situation settles down. But they are interested in coming into Australia. And so the question is, how can a US manufacturer come directly to Australia without a CE certificate? And can they use what they've got already with a domestic US approval? Australians do speak English, sort of English here. That does tend to limit options to looking at Canadian, European or US approvals at the moment. Canada has regulations which are very like TGA, and so that should be relatively straightforward in looking at Canadian licenses. And in fact, TGA for some years has accepted Canadian licenses as evidence for IVDs. It shouldn't be a big stretch to extend that to Canada in some cases. But the FDA processes are different. As we just looked at it briefly, the 510K dossiers are somewhat different. They don't entirely align with the technical file, and certainly the review processes have a fundamentally different requirement for 510Ks, where they do focus on a comparison with another device. rather than a de novo review of the safety and performance evidence, although that's done for the key risks. Certainly anybody who's dealt with the FDA and done a 510K will know that it's not all about the predicate, that the FDA does look at your compliance with standards. FDA recognizes a wide range of standards, including most of those recognized in Europe, and most of the ISO medical device standards. So the FDA does have underneath that 510K process a standards-based review, but not quite the same. So at that point, I think we can go to some questions and answers about how this may all work out. Now, we have some questions here. Firstly, what if I want to come to Australia first? This is Tracy, asks, what if I want to come to Australia first? In other words, I don't have any international regulatory certifications. I just want to come straight here into Australia. I've got something very new. Well, Tracy, the answer to that is that if you're going to do that, you're going to need to come directly to TGA and go for a direct TGA conformity assessment. Now, you do mention that you have a very new technology. It may be worth considering if your device is innovative and meets an unmet need, is going to be something that addresses the clinical need in a new way, whether you would be eligible for TGA's innovative device pathway. So TGA has developed an innovative device pathway, like many regulators have done. It's a relatively straightforward designation process. It involves filling in a detailed application form where you make the case that your device is different, does make a substantial clinical benefit. It's going to change the way a particular condition is treated. It brings something that is a substantial improvement over current therapies or diagnostics, and the technologies are truly different. If you meet those requirements, then you can qualify for the innovative device pathway, and then a TGA conformity assessment is going to go somewhat quicker and be accelerated through the process. TGA is looking at maybe a 5 or 6 month review compared to the 9 to 12 months that might take for a full conformity assessment. So that's the answer there, Tracy. If you've got no US, no Canadian, no European, nothing, then you are going to have to go to full conformity assessment, but there may be ways of doing that quite quickly if you've truly got something different. I have a question from Rosalind, which says, if you have a new IVD developed in Australia, but you want to access the major markets, where would you recommend we go first? To go to the US now or to Europe? So this is if you're an Australian manufacturer looking to go out to the rest of the world, so it's going the other way. Well, firstly, Rosalind, there's not much in the way of European or other regulators recognizing TGA decisions, although the mutual recognition agreement with Europe still exists, and there are a number of manufacturers who currently get CE mark against the medical device directives from TGA. Now, that's going to be difficult as Europe transitions, because I don't believe that TGA is intending to seek designation under the new medical device and IVD regulations. So that arrangement can't continue forever. So you are going to need to look at directly engaging with the overseas regulators and going through the international regulatory process. And you say, should you go to the US first? I think in a regulatory sense, US for IVDs may be easier than Europe. Europe is going to be quite challenging in the near future, but it depends, of course, very much on the nature of the IVD, depends very much on how it's presented to the market. In the United States, IVDs also have processes for laboratory developed tests, although that's a little controversial. The FDA has in the past made it clear that they see the practice of manufacturers supporting a laboratory to develop a test and present it to the market as laboratory developed test as being inconsistent with the intent of US regulations, that if commercial companies are developing the IVD, they really should be submitting to US FDA review. However, that's not been enforced, and certainly a lot of IVDs in America are presented as laboratory-developed tests and don't go through FDA review. And the other point is that a large number of IVDs in the United States are subject to PMA, to pre-market approval processes, which is far more onerous than a 510K. And so that, Rosalind, the answer to your question is it depends on what is the IVD and what level of review is required in the US as to whether you want to tackle the US or whether you do have a go at Europe. Michael asks, we left Australian requirements out of the scope of their initial MDSAP certification audit. Do you know if we can amend the certificate to add Australian requirements in our next surveillance audit and use that for conformity assessment with TGA? Michael, I'm not quite sure how that works for people with current with existing MDSAPs that were done under the MDSAP pilot. The key point here is that the medical device single audit program in the pilot phase, applicants were allowed to do what Michael has done, and that is just choose which jurisdictions they wish to be included in the scope of that MDSAP audit. In other words, you just went to the markets of interest. You just got assessed against the markets of interest. The change that's happened with the MDSAP in its full rollout is that you no longer have that choice. In a full MDSAP, if you were applying today, you would have to comply with the requirements of all of the jurisdictions. And so it may be that when they come around for the next time, Michael, that you're going to need to be extending that at some point when you do a renewal. That will be, I suspect. So it's not a matter of do you have the choice. It may be that you will be required to include TGA and Brazil and Canada and the US. All within all of the participants of MDSAP, you're going to have to be assessed against all of them, and Japan. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works out for you. But MDSAP is certainly taking off. The number of audits being conducted under the medical device single audit program is going through the roof. It's growing almost exponentially, and that's really been driven by the Canadian government decision to require MDSAP audit as the only means of having a device review done for Canada to replace the previous Canadian medical device conformity assessments system, this CandiCAS reviews. They're being replaced by MDSAP by the end of this year, I think. And if you want to market in Canada, that's the only choice you've got. So another question here from David says, okay, I'm interested. I have an Australian, I have a US regulatory approval, but I don't have a CE mark. How do I go about this? Have I got to wait for TGA to announce? He asks, do I have to wait for TGA to announce their process, or can I start now? And I think the answer there is it's worth engaging with TGA. It's worth making the inquiry. The agency is clearly thinking hard about this. It's certainly been their practice in the past to do a soft start to such regulatory changes and maybe do a few trial cases quite quietly. So I would suggest that if you're interested in that, David, then think about opening up a conversation with the agency and seeing what's possible and whether you could seek to take your existing international regulatory approval to TGA for their review. TGA are already doing this for conformity assessments, of course. They're already abridging conformity assessments based on the presence of international review evidence, although that's a longer process. This is the next step, and really using the current application audit process, which should be quicker. Okay, well, they're the main questions. I think at that point, we'll draw the webinar to a close. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I would just announce our next webinar. So we hope to see you next time in July on Tuesday, the 24th of July, Australian time, which is going to be an early morning webinar this time, same as this current time slot, and will be Monday, the 23rd of July in USA, in the morning, late in the evening in Europe. We're going to look at 3D printing devices, verification of 3D printed devices. We'll look at the particular technical questions of how customized devices made by 3D printing, as well as off the shelf, present particular challenges to verification, especially if every device is different. How do you verify things like biomechanics? We're going to look at specifically 3 issues. We're going to look at biocompatibility for these additive manufacturing processes. We're going to look at how you do a mechanical assessment, the biomechanics of a 3D printed device, and verify strength, suitability for mechanical performance, and then look also at sterilization and how 3D printed devices are validated for sterilization, given that each device is different. That should be an interesting topic. I'm hoping to see you, to have you join me on the 24th or 23rd of July, depending on your location. That's next time. Meanwhile, if you've found this webinar interesting, we have a whole lot more on our website and under our training video section. You can follow me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, visit our company page on LinkedIn, or our YouTube channel, where all of our prior webinars are recorded, as will this one be recorded, and up on the YouTube channel or on the website for you to review on demand. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you next time.